"Step away from the vessel, sir. Hands where I can see them." That was the first thing I heard on my second morning in this neighborhood. Not birds, not a neighborly hello, not the gentle hum of lake water. No, it was a deputy yelling at me with his hand on his holster, like I was smuggling missiles in a fishing boat. And all because I'd parked my 35 FT retired Navy patrol boat perfectly legally, in my own damn driveway. Right behind him, standing in full victory pose with a phone pointed at my face, was the embodiment of Hoa nightmares, a woman in a neon pink blazer, floral blouse, and the world's most aggressive bob haircut. "He's got military equipment," she was saying to dispatch, as if I were preparing for an amphibious invasion. That was the first time I met Gladys. I hadn't even unpacked all the boxes yet. I'd retired from the Navy just 2 months earlier, after 30 years of service and countless deployments. My wife and I had bought the house on the lake as a peaceful final chapter, a place to fish, right? Maybe teach boating classes to kids. The boat, which I'd named the Liberty Belle, had been with me through thick and thin. She'd been stripped of weapons, of course, but she still had that unmistakable hull, a sleek matte gray body, and my Navy insignia proudly painted across the side. I figured in a lakeside neighborhood, folks might appreciate a vessel with history. I figured wrong. Gladys was still filming as the deputy approached. "Sir, do you have any documentation for this watercraft?" I stepped down from the porch, barefoot, coffee in hand. "I sure do," I said, handing over the official vehicle registration and county approval for large vessel parking. Also, not to nitpick, but that's a patrol boat, not a weapon of mass destruction. The deputy blinked, clearly realizing this was not the kind of call he was expecting. Then I pulled out my ID, Commander Jack Nolan, recently retired. Everything's by the book. Gladys' face twisted into a forced smile, the kind that said she'd rather chew nails than admit she was wrong. "Well, I don't think military vehicles belong in a family neighborhood. It's scaring people." I looked around. The only one on the street was her. "You mean it's scaring you," I said. She tried to wave it off. "There's a visual aesthetic we're supposed to maintain, and that boat is not in the spirit of our community." That's when I first heard her utter the words that would haunt me for weeks. "It's an HOA violation. A serious one." The deputy handed back my paperwork. "Looks all legal to me, ma'am. There's no ordinance here banning boat parking. As long as it's not obstructing traffic, there's nothing I can do." Gladys' nostrils flared like she just smelled something foul. She turned to me and hissed, "This isn't over." Then she stormed off, heels clicking against the pavement like angry horse hooves. I watched her march back to a sparkling white SUV parked diagonally across my neighbor's lawn, adorned with a magnet that read, "HOA Neighborhood Coordinator." That's when it clicked. She wasn't just a nosy neighbor. She was the type who held power in a tight grip, with the kind of righteousness that came from printing her own rulebook. By noon, she'd emailed me an official Hoa notice, typed entirely in Comic Sans, declaring my boat a Class 3 violation of curbside decorum standards. It referenced bylaws I'd never seen before and ended with a polite but firm request that I relocate the vessel within 24 hours to avoid escalating consequences. Attached was a picture of my boat, edited with red arrows and text that said things like, "Intimidating 2 children," and "Looks like a war zone." I laughed so hard I nearly spit coffee on my laptop. I wasn't about to let this go. I pulled out the community's actual whole rule book, handed to me during closing by my realtor, and flipped to the section on parking. There it was. Homeowners were permitted to park watercraft in their driveways for up to 72 hours, provided they didn't block the road or encroach on other properties. I emailed her back, highlighting the relevant sections, and signed off with a cheerful "Thanks, Commander Jack." 10 minutes later, I saw her walking up the driveway with a stack of paper. She slapped it against my mailbox like she was serving a warrant. I walked out to retrieve it. It wasn't official at all, just a makeshift Gladys addendum to the Hoa guidelines, featuring absurd new rules about acceptable vehicle colors, plant heights, and even noise generated by the presence of intimidating marine vehicles. I read it 3 times before realizing she just made the whole thing up. I might have let it go if not for the drone. That night, as my wife and I sat on the porch sipping tea, I heard the telltale buzz of a small quadcopter hovering over the boat. I turned on the floodlight and spotted it, camera pointed straight at the hull. I traced the signal back and saw it descend gently onto Gladys' lawn, where she stood waiting with a tablet in hand. The next morning, I installed a counter-surveillance camera of my own. Not military grade, but close enough. It was small, discreet, and capable of motion capture. By that afternoon, I had hours of footage of Gladys walking slowly by my driveway, sometimes muttering to herself, sometimes snapping photos with an iPad the size of a cookie sheet. Things escalated when she called a community meeting, one I hadn't been invited to, and tried to pass an emergency motion banning combat-style vessels from residential zones. Luckily, not all my neighbors were on her side. One, an ex-Marine named Rick, stood up and said, "Lady, that man served his country. That boat scares you because it reminds you you've never done anything that mattered." The room went silent. Gladys turned redder than a stop sign, but it didn't stop her. The next day, I woke up to find a bright orange sticker slapped on the windshield of the Liberty Bell, reading, "Immediate removal required. No city insignia, no barcode. Just Gladys' handwriting and a fake stamp that looked like it had been made with a potato." I peeled it off and calmly taped it to my front door. Underneath a new sign I just put up, "Honoring Service Veterans Welcome. Petty Tyrants Not." As I stood back admiring it, my phone buzzed. A text from the sheriff. "She's called 911 again. This time, she says your boat is emitting sonar. We're on our way." I didn't even flinch. I poured another cup of coffee, went out to the driveway, and leaned against the bow of the boat. Because one thing Gladys didn't know, that emitting sonar wasn't even half the tech I had quietly installed on board. And if she thought this was the end of it, she hadn't seen anything yet. The second time Gladys called 911, the deputy didn't even bother getting out of the cruiser. He just rolled his window down halfway, glanced at the boat, glanced at me, and then let out a tired sigh. I walked up to him, coffee in hand as usual, and he shook his head. "She says it's emitting sonar pulses, causing neighborhood headaches. Claims her dog's been twitching ever since it showed up." I chuckled. "Tell her to buy her dog a pair of sea legs." He laughed quietly and then added, "Between you and me, sir, you're not doing anything wrong. But she's compiling something. Says she's got a document going to the Hoa board this week." I already had a feeling about that. Gladys wasn't the type to let something go when she could weaponize bureaucracy instead. That evening, a flyer showed up on every doorstep in the neighborhood, slipped inside clear plastic door hangers, like it was some sort of political campaign. The top said, "Emergency Hoa session, boat dangers, security risks, and property values at risk." Below that, in aggressive bold letters, was a list of reasons why Commander Nolan's warship was a community threat. One line claimed the vessel invoked images of active combat and psychological trauma. Another said it harbored machinery unfamiliar and frightening to children. My favorite was the one that read, "Unsubstantiated sonar emissions may interfere with pacemakers." That one had my wife cackling into her wine glass. At the bottom of the page was a declaration that Gladys had created a new document called Gladys Code, Emergency Safety Addendum to Hoa Bylaws. No one had voted on it. No one had asked for it. And yet she claimed she had full authority to enact it in the interest of neighborhood harmony. I went to my mailbox and found my own copy of the flyer with a sticky note attached reading, "You've been warned." I called Rick, the former Marine from up the road, and asked him if he'd seen the flyer. "Oh, I saw it," he grumbled. My wife wanted to frame it. She thinks it's the funniest thing since our daughter's goat chewed through Gladys' tulips. We agreed to show up at the emergency meeting, not to protest, but to observe. I wanted to see just how far she thought she could push her luck. The meeting was held in the clubhouse on Thursday night. The air was thick with tension, like something about to snap. Gladys stood at the front in a red blazer this time, holding a stack of papers and pacing like a general preparing for war. A projector screen behind her displayed a slideshow titled, "Unseen Threats: The Psychological Toll of Military Machinery in Peaceful Suburbs." I took a seat in the back, sunglasses on indoors just to annoy her. Rick sat next to me with a giant bucket of popcorn. Gladys launched into a speech that was part history lecture, part courtroom drama, part science fiction. She claimed to have consulted experts in psychological wellness, who determined the boat's visual presence could trigger generational trauma. She cited made-up case studies about property value plummets and potential liabilities. Then she produced drone footage of my backyard and driveway taken at various times of day, with captions like unusual activity at 0400 hours. An object moved slightly, possible evasive positioning. When someone in the room asked if she was implying my boat was preparing to escape, Gladys nodded solemnly and said, "We can't rule anything out." Then she introduced her posse, a group of 4 neighbors she'd somehow convinced to join her cause. One was a guy who once tried to sue the power company for flickering streetlights. Another was an elderly woman who didn't realize the boat wasn't a submarine. The third had a long-standing grudge with me after I accidentally blocked his driveway during move-in. The fourth just seemed confused. Together they looked like the board of a failed neighborhood watch program. Each one took turns voicing vague complaints about feeling uncomfortable or not sleeping well since the boat appeared. One of them said he felt watched, which was ironic considering the amount of surveillance Gladys had been running. Then it was my turn. I didn't plan to speak, but when Gladys insisted that the vessel's presence constitutes an imminent and escalating threat, I raised my hand. The room fell silent. I walked to the front slowly and turned to face them. I served this country for 3 decades. That boat was a part of rescue missions, medical supply runs, hurricane evacuations. It's a boat, not a battleship. It saved lives, and I brought it here to fish. A few people nodded. One older man clapped once before realizing no one else was clapping and awkwardly stopped. I pulled a laminated copy of the HOAS actual bylaws from my folder. These are the only binding regulations in this neighborhood. Nowhere in here does it say you can ban a parked watercraft, and certainly nowhere does it give a resident the right to run unauthorized surveillance or create their own code of conduct. Gladys tried to interrupt, but I held up a hand. I've already filed a cease and desist regarding the drone footage. If this harassment continues, I'll pursue civil charges. Gladys' face was a mix of fury and embarrassment, but she forced a smile. This isn't personal, Commander. This is about protecting our community. I looked at her. It became personal the moment you forged rules and used 911 as your personal concierge. You're not protecting anything. You're just afraid of what you don't understand. After the meeting, a few neighbors quietly approached to shake my hand. One offered to help me repaint the boat if it would help it blend in more, but I politely declined. "Let it stand out," I said. "It's earned that right." I walked home feeling like maybe, just maybe, people were beginning to see through her. But the next morning, I woke up to find something taped across my front door. A new citation, laminated this time, with the seal of Gladys Code printed at the top. Beneath it a line that read, "This is your final warning. Next steps, legal escalation." Next to it on the porch was a plastic toy Navy battleship. Someone had written "This means war" on the side with a marker. That's when I knew Gladys wasn't just bluffing. She was preparing to escalate, and I had no doubt she thought she could win. But what she didn't know was that I hadn't survived naval ambushes, psychological warfare, and 23 months straight in active zones just to be taken down by a woman who spelled surveillance wrong on official-looking documents. She wanted a war? Fine, but I didn't fight with fists. I fought with precision, patience, and the full weight of protocol. And next time she tried to hit me with HOA power, she'd learn exactly how dangerous it was to pick a fight with someone trained to take down entire operations with a single pen stroke. The paint job wasn't subtle. I found it the next morning as the sun broke over the lake, splashing gold across the driveway and splashing bright pink across the entire port side of my boat. Not just any pink, glittery, sticky, neon pink. The kind that clung to fiberglass like guilt on a guilty conscience. And written in curling letters across the hull, someone had scrawled, "Float this somewhere else." My wife came out just in time to see me staring at it, jaw clenched, mug still steaming in my hand. She didn't say a word, just let out a long breath that said, "We're past the point of pretending this is civil." I knew exactly who did it. There was no need to guess. Only one person in this neighborhood had both the obsession and the absolute lack of self-awareness to commit an act this loud and ridiculous. Gladys had crossed a line from bureaucratic harassment to criminal vandalism, and the part that really grated was the smugness I could already feel waiting on her face. She wanted to provoke me. She wanted to goad me into a mistake, something she could twist into a lawsuit or a restraining order. But I wasn't going to play by her script. Instead, I calmly set my coffee on the porch railing and walked around to the camera I'd installed above. The garage, it was motion-triggered, high-resolution, and silently brilliant. I pulled the footage and scanned through the night. There she was, 11:46 p.m., wearing a black tracksuit like she was on some secret mission, holding a plastic bucket in one hand and a brush in the other. She moved with exaggerated stealth, crouching low even though no one was around, slinking across the lawn like she was auditioning for a role in a low-budget spy movie. I watched her smear the paint onto the hull, paused to check her phone, then stepped back to admire her work like some delusional artist. It was all on tape, every glittery smear. I called the sheriff. I didn't want to make it a spectacle, but it was time someone else saw the full extent of what I was dealing with. When Deputy Lane arrived, he stood there with his hands on his hips, shaking his head in disbelief. "You're kidding me," he muttered. "She did this?" "The whole lady," I said. I handed him a USB with the footage and gave a statement. Lane nodded and promised to file the report and inform Gladys of the complaint. "She's probably not going to like it," he said. I shrugged. "She can add it to the list of things she doesn't like, right after the Constitution and common sense." The next morning, instead of showing remorse, Gladys doubled down. She posted on the neighborhood forum a site she'd taken over like a tyrant with a keyboard. That mysterious forces had painted the boat, and that she had no idea who did it, but that color improvements were possibly welcomed by the community. The post ended with a poll. Should this war machine remain parked in our peaceful neighborhood? I watched the poll slowly tick up in favor of, yes, it's legal and fine. But that didn't stop her from continuing her campaign. So, I fought back, but not with vandalism or shouting. I organized an event. With help from Rick and a few local veterans, I arranged a community boat washing fundraiser. We called it Clean Waters, Clear Minds, and the idea was to raise money for the local VA clinic. Word spread fast. A few neighbors donated. Some just came for the hot dogs and lemonade. But by noon, we had nearly 50 people in my front yard, sponges in hand, scrubbing glitter from the Liberty Bell while music played from a Bluetooth speaker. One of the kids asked if the boat had ever been in a storm, and I knelt down and told him about a rescue mission we ran off the Gulf Coast. The boy's eyes lit up. That boat stopped being a problem and started being a story. Then Gladys showed up. She came stomping down the sidewalk in a coral blazer and massive sunglasses, holding her phone out in front of her like it was a weapon. She filmed everyone, muttering loud enough for the mic to pick it up. Unauthorized gathering. Code for B no permit. This is a disturbance. She pointed her phone at the boat and then at Rick, who waved cheerfully while eating a bratwurst. She tried to confront one of the elderly volunteers, an 80-year-old Navy widow. But the woman looked her square in the eyes and said, "I've outlived 2 wars and 3 husbands, and I'm not afraid of a woman with a clipboard." Gladys looked like someone had slapped her with a wet fish. A local news van pulled up about 10 minutes later. Someone had called them, not me, and a young reporter jumped out, thrilled to cover something other than another lost cat story. She asked me to speak, and I kept it simple. I talked about the fundraiser, about the boat's history, and about how it wasn't a weapon, but a reminder of service, commitment, and peace. Gladys, of course, tried to push her way into the shot, ranting about unauthorized events and psychological distress. But the camera mostly caught her yelling at a child who was trying to pet my dog. The next day, the footage aired. Not just the story of the fundraiser, but also Gladys' meltdown. Her wild accusations were broadcast to the entire county, and social media didn't hold back. One meme showed her screeching with the caption, HOA stands for Harass Our Admiral. Another video dubbed her voice over footage of a military drill, turning her into a parody of a drill sergeant losing her mind. I didn't post any of it, but I saw it. So did she. The retaliation came quietly. That night, all of the lights on my property flickered. A power surge knocked out the cameras temporarily. When I checked the circuit box, I found signs someone had tampered with it. Muddy footprints, a loose wire, and a bent panel cover. It wasn't an accident, but I didn't call the sheriff. Not this time. I had something else in mind. I contacted a friend from my Navy days who now worked in digital forensics. We started looking into something Gladys hadn't counted on anyone challenging her digital presence, especially her control over whole communications and voting procedures. I gave him access to the neighborhood site she ran, where suspicious polls always leaned in her favor, and where posts she disliked disappeared instantly. Within a day, he found something, a hidden admin panel with her personal email, IP logs showing she was deleting opposing comments and even voting on behalf of homeowners who hadn't logged in. It wasn't just unethical, it was illegal. I didn't say anything. Not yet. I wanted her to feel safe, to believe that she'd won. So, I printed out a still frame from the camera footage, her holding the paint bucket, and mailed it to her in a plain envelope with no return address. On the back, I'd written one sentence: "Precision always beats pink." The letter must have rattled her. The next morning, she didn't come out to water her garden like she always did at 6:30 sharp. No patrol walk, no clipboard march, no drone in the sky. It was the quietest the neighborhood had been since I'd parked my boat. But I knew that kind of silence didn't mean retreat. It meant regrouping. Gladys didn't just back down. She recalibrated and came back sharper, louder, and somehow more absurd. And sure enough, the calm didn't last long. 2 days later, I was served a court summons. Gladys had filed a civil suit. On the front page, in dramatic underlined font, she alleged emotional distress, property devaluation, targeted intimidation, and an intentional campaign of mental destabilization via symbolic naval aggression. The first time I read it, I laughed. The second time I got angry. The third time I realized this was exactly what she wanted. A public fight. Something she could twist into a spectacle. Something that could drag me through the muck and maybe give her just enough leverage to win over the board or at least silence me into submission. But she underestimated one critical detail. My wife, Caroline, wasn't just a seasoned partner. She was a retired JAG officer, 20 years in the Navy's legal course, and she had never lost a courtroom scrap. When I handed her the papers, she scanned them silently, then looked up at me with the kind of glint in her eye that made me pity Gladys. Before we'd even filed our response, we didn't just file a countersuit. We filed it with documentation, footage, witness testimony, and a list of HOA code violations longer than a Thanksgiving grocery list: harassment, trespassing, false emergency reports, voter fraud within the HOA board, and digital tampering of public record. Rick provided a sworn statement. 2 neighbors confirmed seeing Gladys with the paint bucket. One man came forward with screenshots showing his votes on neighborhood policies had been altered, votes he never even cast. Another neighbor, a quiet older woman named Dolores, brought a folder full of newsletters that showed how Gladys had slowly taken over communications, edging out the real board with fabricated signatures and staged meetings. We had evidence, we had strategy, we had motive, and we had a court date. The day of the hearing, Gladys arrived with a man in an ill-fitting suit who looked like he just Googled lawyer outfit. The night before, she wore a royal blue power blazer in a smug expression, holding a stack of printed images of my boat like they were going to convict me on appearance alone. When our case was called, the judge, a no-nonsense woman with sharp glasses and a sharper stare, sighed and asked Gladys' lawyer to begin. He stammered through a shaky speech about neighborhood peace, feelings, community standards, and the supposed militarization of residential zones. At one point, he actually said, "The presence of sonar-capable vehicles near unshielded households may cause irreparable neurological discomfort." Caroline leaned over to me and whispered, "That's not even a sentence. Then it was our turn. Caroline stood like a storm in a pantsuit, calm, precise, unshakable. She laid out a timeline, piece by piece, beginning with the first 911 call and ending with the power box tampering. She presented video footage. She introduced a copy of the real HOA bylaws. She played the drone footage on a monitor and then played a second clip. One Gladys had deleted from the community server that showed her instructing a neighbor to vote yes, or I'll tell people about your fire pit fines. The room fell silent. Gladys visibly stiffened. Caroline ended by holding up the ridiculous pink paint photo and saying, "Your Honor, this wasn't about property values. It was about control." Gladys stood up and shrieked something about bias, about conspiracies, about military bullying. The judge asked her to sit down 3 times. When she refused, the bailiff stepped forward, and only then did she finally drop back into her seat. The judge looked over both filings, reviewed the evidence, and announced her ruling on the spot. Gladys' suit was dismissed with prejudice. Our countersuit would proceed to arbitration, with the court recommending immediate investigation into Hoa misconduct. Gladys' jaw dropped. Mine didn't move. I'd expected this. Caroline just slid her notes into her folder like she was clearing a dinner plate. But the best part wasn't the courtroom. It was the fallout. The moment we got home, my inbox exploded. Dozens of neighbors emailed with apologies, congratulations, or both. A few offered to repaint the boat. Others just sent gift cards or homemade cookies. Rick dropped by with a six-pack and said, "That was the most satisfying thing I've seen since I got honorably discharged." And then came the real twist. One of Gladys' closest allies, a man named Craig who'd always been her quiet enforcer, knocked on my door with a folder in hand. "I can't be part of it anymore," he said. "She made me sign things I didn't understand. She promised we were fixing the neighborhood, but it's just about her. Always was." Inside the folder were emails, dozens of them. Gladys' digital fingerprints on everything from HOA takeovers to vote rigging to personal threats. We turned them over to the city attorney's office. A formal complaint was filed. An emergency vote was held to reconstitute the Hoa board. Gladys was removed by unanimous vote. She didn't even show up to protest. Someone said she was staying with her sister in a neighboring town. While she recovered from public betrayal, I didn't know if that was true, but I didn't much care. For the first time since moving in, the neighborhood felt normal, peaceful. Someone even left a welcome sign at the foot of my driveway that said, "Hoa stands for Hands Off Admirals." The Liberty Bell gleamed again, her hull freshly restored, her flag proudly flying. Caroline and I finally sat on the porch one evening without expecting sirens or citations. Even the lake looked calmer. But just as we were settling in, my phone buzzed. It was an old number, classified once long ago. I hesitated before answering. A familiar voice spoke on the other end. "Commander Nolan, it's Lieutenant Harrow. Sorry to bother you on leave, sir, but we've got a civilian situation developing. Need some leadership on the ground, not a combat op, more like containment and strategic negotiation." I laughed softly. "You mean in a show?" Silence. Then he replied, "Actually, yeah, something like that." I looked at the boat, at my wife, at the peaceful street that had once been a battlefield. Then I answered, "Send me the file, but tell them this time I'm bringing a pressure washer." The peace didn't last. It never really does when someone like Gladys feels cornered. A few quiet weeks passed after the court hearing and her removal from the Hoa board. The neighborhood settled into a comfortable rhythm again. Kids played outside. The community garden stopped mysteriously dying, and no one found fake violation notices taped to their doors at dawn. The Liberty Bell sat proudly in my driveway, polished, restored, and occasionally admired by neighbors passing by with a wave and a smile. But even while the surface looked calm, I knew there were ripples beneath. And sure enough, the final wave came on a Saturday morning, right as the coffee hit its perfect temperature. Gladys came back, not with lawyers or drones or fake ordinances, but with a spectacle. She parked her SUV sideways across my driveway, blocking it entirely, then chained the doors shut from the inside. The windows were covered in handwritten signs like, "Veterans don't own neighborhoods." and stop the floating menace? She had a loudspeaker plugged into the dashboard and was broadcasting some warped message about property rights and tyranny, repeating the same phrases over and over like a broken record. She live-streamed the whole thing, speaking into the camera with a tone like she was reporting from a war zone. "Here I am," she said, "a woman under siege for demanding order, decency, and the return of peace to this once beautiful community." It was absurd. Neighbors came out of their homes, phones in hand, filming the spectacle. Rick stood across the street with a lawn chair and a bowl of popcorn. One of the teenage boys yelled, "Are we being punked?" Another neighbor, a nurse on night shift, came out in pajamas and just shouted, "Move your damn car." But Gladys didn't move. If anything, she amped up the volume. "This is a protest," she screeched into the mic, "a stand against HOA corruption, military intimidation, and the normalization of surveillance equipment in family zones." I didn't call the police this time. I didn't need to. The sheriff's office had been keeping an eye on her ever since the court ruling. They showed up in under 10 minutes, lights flashing, to deputies stepping out with weary expressions. One of them knocked gently on her window. She refused to open it. The others started cutting the chain. As they pulled open the door and tried to help her out, she dropped to the floor of the car like a toddler having a meltdown, wailing about persecution and abuse. The live stream was still running. I watched as her audience, only a few dozen viewers, flooded the comments with laughter, facepalm emojis, and remarks like "Gladys gone wild" and "Hoa hysteria, episode 7. She was cited for obstruction, trespassing, and public disturbance. She screamed the whole way into the cruiser. As they drove her off, I stood at the end of the driveway sipping my coffee. I didn't wave. I didn't smile. I just stood there watching her finally disappear down the street she no longer controlled. That afternoon, I hosted a barbecue. It wasn't planned, but the neighbors needed it. We grilled steaks and hot dogs, let the kids turn the garden hose into a slip and slide, and played music that probably would have driven Gladys mad. A few folks brought up the idea of forming a new Hoa board, one that actually cared about the community, not just controlling it. I told them I had no interest in leading, but I'd support anyone with a level head and a decent sense of humor. Rick nominated his dog for president. Surprisingly, the idea stuck. By the end of the night, Captain, the golden retriever, had been unanimously voted in as honorary HOA chair. Someone even printed a certificate. The following week, I received a letter from the mayor's office. Apparently, the footage of the boat fundraiser and Gladys outbursts had circulated beyond local news. There was now a petition to recognize me for extraordinary community service and commitment to peaceful resolution. I wasn't seeking any recognition, but it made me laugh. They invited me to a small ceremony at City Hall. I agreed, mostly because Caroline insisted I wear my uniform one more time. She said it'd be good for the town to see what respect looked like. Gladys tried to stop that, too. Word got out, and she filed an online petition to cancel the ceremony, claiming it glorified militarized civilian intimidation. It backfired badly. The city responded by issuing a restraining order barring her from attending any future civic events, due to repeated harassment and public disruption. Her house, no longer adorned with flower pots and solar lights, soon had a foreclosure notice stuck to the front door. Word was she defaulted on her Hoa dues and lost a legal battle over fines she tried to hide under a fake company name. I didn't celebrate. I didn't need to. Karma was thorough enough on its own. Finally, I did what I meant to do the whole time. I launched the Liberty Bell. The new Hoa board had voted to open up the community boat ramp to all residents equally. I rolled her down the driveway, clean and gleaming in the morning sun. Rick and a couple of the other guys helped guide her into the water. She slipped in like she belonged, which she did. I stood at the helm for a long moment before firing up the engine. She rumbled with a quiet strength, steady and sure. Caroline climbed aboard with a cooler and a grin. "Let's go find some peace," she said. We spent the afternoon drifting across the lake. No drones overhead, no shouting in the distance, just the lapping of water, the warmth of the sun, and the soft bark of Captain from shore. I looked out at the horizon, that calm blue line where everything finally felt balanced. And for the first time since moving into this chaotic little pocket of suburbia, I finally felt like I belonged. As we neared the far edge of the lake, my phone buzzed again, the same number as before. I hesitated, then answered. The voice was calm. Official, Commander Nolan, this is HQ. We're forming a task force, domestic, civilian leadership needed. No guns, just grit. Are you interested? I looked at Caroline. She was already shaking her head with a smile. Tell them no, she mouthed. I paused. Only if I can bring my boat, I said into the phone. There was a pause, then laughter on the other end. You're cleared for sail, Commander. I hung up and turned back to the water. Gladys was gone. Her crusade had sunk under the weight of her own absurdity. And in her place, peace returned, not just for me, but for the whole neighborhood. It had taken a battle, sure, but it had also taken patience, precision, and a boat that refused to budge. The Liberty Belle glided forward, and I let her lead the way.